Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is Battleship Bismarck Part 32. The studies in Bowmanville gave me, a professional naval officer, the first direct insight into the devastation that Hitler had wrought and continued to wreak on the legal system in order to carry through his dictatorship over our national life. This is an area about which a great deal has since been published and about which, writing from an autobiographical perspective, I can mention only a few points from my own experience. The course of study at Bowmanville began at a time when the Allied press was reporting a spectacular and apparently new attack by Hitler on the German judicature. The background lay in his speech to the Greater German Reichstag, which assembled for the last time on this occasion, in the Kroll Opera House in Berlin on April 26th in 1942. At its end, the so-called Full Powers Act, later interpreted as the Supreme Enabling Act, proposed by Hermann Göring was unanimously accepted. Naturally, the details, text or official significance of this law were not immediately available to prisoners of war in far-off Canada. As a rule, we could obtain so complete a picture only over a long period of time, often months, by various means. The Canadian radio, Allied news publications, secretly received radio broadcasts from Germany, the gradual receipt of statutes, specialized journals and the like. And so, now it was some time until we really understood this Reichstag session, about which the available extracts from Hitler's speech had only shown his usual violent rhetoric and dark threats. But what did it mean? Among other things, I restrict myself to the field of law, Hitler had himself proclaimed supreme magistrate, and this without being bound by existing legal formulas. The public acceptance of the explanation he had given the Reichstag on July 13th of 1934 after the murders in the Röhm affair, in which he had said, "In this hour I was responsible for the destiny of the German nation and therefore the German people's supreme magistrate," no longer satisfied him. Henceforth, he would no longer publicly need a spectacular special motive to commit murder. From now on, therefore, murder at any time, murder enemies of the regime, critics of the regime, with or without the law. What was new about that? What was new about the long-established absolute abrogation of the separation of powers? In the first part of his April 1942 speech, Hitler once again and vehemently denounced the Jewish element also responsible for this war, attacking over and over again the Jewish world pest in the style of his speech on January 30th of 1941, which I had had to listen to on board Bismarck. His fury towards the Jews now appeared to reach a new height, and, as I learned after the war, he had in fact just signed a decree concerning the systematic intellectual fight against Jews as a duty required by the war. Among other things, it regulated the state's right to confiscate Jewish cultural properties that are ownerless or not of incontestably clear provenance. How might they have become truly ownerless? Well, scarcely otherwise than by physical force, of which I had observed a small sample on the Kurfürstendamm on November 9th of 1938. Only now and in the darkness of wartime disorders, such physical force would be exercised even more limitlessly and fiercely. In his aims, Hitler was extremism itself, and he knew he would easily drag the Germans, as he understood them, down his path. Anyone who was an eyewitness to and perceived the meaning of the 1938 pogrom already had Auschwitz before his eyes, not by name, not by number of victims, not by technique of murder, but as one of the terrible scenes from the vision of the unbounded expansion of power that his mania seemed to have burned into Hitler. In 1938, most Germans still had not grasped that it was Hitler himself who wanted all this. In his memoirs, Räder wrote, "Hitler assured me, most earnestly, that the entire action of November 9th of 1938, which had come to a head as a spontaneous reaction to the murder of a member of the German legation in Paris, contradicted his policy in every respect. It had happened without his knowledge or consent. The Gauleiter of Berlin, Goebbels himself, had let go the helm on him." Even today, there are historians who deny Hitler's personal authorship of the murder of the Jews. They claim that no written order can be traced to him. These historians either did not live through that period in Germany or did not do so with an observant intelligence. For Hitler's long arm reached into almost every corner of the country. It was easy for him to inconspicuously give signals, and the starting point of his orders could be hidden without trace in the mazes of the apparatus of power, covering up responsibilities when that was indicated. But a foreigner who saw through Hitler at an early date was Sir Horace Rumbold, the British ambassador to Berlin. On May the 11th, 1933, the day of his first conversation with Hitler, he wired his foreign minister expressing his conviction that Herr Hitler is himself responsible for the anti-Jewish policy of the German government, and that it would be a mistake to believe that it is his policy of his wilder men whom he has difficulty in controlling. Anybody who has had the opportunity of listening to his remarks on the subject of Jews could not have failed, like myself, to realize that he is a fanatic on the subject. He is also convinced of his mission to fight communism and destroy Marxism, which term embraces all his political adversaries. After 3 months of Hitler's regime, Rumbold, a foreigner, had already grasped what still had not dawned on Räder after 5.5 years under the regime in a leading position in Berlin. During the program of study, I could almost smile at the allusions in the Reich Supreme Court's decisions to the universally acknowledged competence of the NSDAP in private lawsuits. The Reich Supreme Court is quoted as, "The concepts of the community of housing and the responsibilities of owner and tenant are in no way in conflict if in a dispute one party turns to the NSDAP. The party is always competent." Almost amusing, yet the brown-sprinkled doctrines of some professors in the Reich caused anger and anguish. These professors, who once pledged to preserve the laws of Western civilization, were assisting Hitler in consolidating his criminal state. These representatives of the legal profession, over whom the Führer repeatedly poured his scorn for their defective personalities, their legal hair-splitting that only stood in the way of his political frenzy and by whom to be supported, he basically thought laughable. Whether they acted from coercion, stupidity, or opportunism, what did it matter? I considered it a deplorable spectacle. Hopefully, after the war, these gentlemen would never again be heard from the teacher's chair. This was a vain hope, however. In post-war conversations, the lack of resistance by the German military to the initiation of the Hitler dictatorship has often been held up to me. It is quite true that, corresponding to the divisions of power in the state, after the middle or end of 1933, only the Reichswehr could have curbed Hitler. But, I am accustomed to answer, you can't expect military men, of all people, to pass a democratic litmus test. You must realize that their traditions made them, at least at first, especially susceptible to the Prussian values that the Nazis put out like flypaper: discipline, training, duty and obedience, national greatness, the subordination of the individual to the community. To check the Hitler movement, the military would have had to be motivated by democratic, Christian and legal-minded civilian circles. By politicians, churches, universities and the judicial system, for example. No impulse came from there when it could still have borne fruit. And according to the doctrines I know to have been held by the leading jurists of the time, nothing was to be expected from there. During our studies at Bowmanville, there were indications that after the war the civil law code would be replaced by a people's law code. The authors of the former, stemming from the 19th century, had long been showered with abuse by the brown shirts. They were denounced as individualists, liberals and capitalists. In the new legal system, the healthy instincts of the people, à la Hitler, would be the baseline of the judicial process. It happened otherwise. The military defeat of May 1945 allowed the good old civil law code to survive. Back in Bowmanville proper, things took a turn. And the Canadian government, in response to the proceedings of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, has ordered that henceforth designated officers and men of the German army in this camp will be handcuffed. A part of the hurried, English-inflected German sentences of the Canadian camp interpreter had been blown away by the often strong wind in Bowmanville. The background and origin of the announcement by the interpreter, who assembled us to hear it after a routine muster one evening in October of 1942, remained in the dark. Amazement reigned. Indignation was widespread. The following day, the Canadian camp commander gave the German camp leader a list of the army members concerned. Until further notice, the latter were to present themselves at the camp gate in the morning to be handcuffed and in the evening to have the handcuffs removed. The excitement in the camp increased. The German camp leader protested to the Canadian commandant against this violation of international law, but the latter stood firm and set a deadline for carrying out his government's orders, failing which he threatened to use appropriate force. The camp leader also stood firm. "Commandant, our resistance is assured." The chain of events which would transplant the military scenario molded in Europe to Bowmanville had begun in August of that year at Dieppe on the Channel coast. 2 Canadian brigades and a group of British commandos had undertaken a landing there in preparation of the subsequent Allied invasion of France. Their objectives were partly achieved, but mostly not, and after a bloody engagement, both sides had taken prisoners. The Canadians had handcuffed the German prisoners, supposedly so that they could not destroy their papers after being captured. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht and the British War Office had entered a public altercation over such a violation of international law, threats of reprisals were exchanged, and a chain reaction was unleashed. Its development rolled along until the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht ordered that beginning on October 8, 1942, 4,000 British prisoners in German custody would be handcuffed each day from 8 in the morning until 9 at night. The British reacted immediately and, among other things, ordered that, with Ottawa's agreement, 1,100 German army members in Canadian custody should be handcuffed. This was the command that the Canadian camp interpreter had intended to make clear after the evening muster. On the day on which our army comrades were to have been handcuffed for the first time, we all refused to turn out for the roll call, stayed inside our living quarters and barricaded ourselves there. It was open rebellion, a direct challenge to our Canadian warders. Would these, the veteran guards, they were indeed all older men, suffice to overcome our resistance? After tension-filled hours, the answer to that question came with the arrival, easily observed through the fence, of a company of younger frontline soldiers. They formed up outside, where they were required to turn in their live ammunitions and were armed instead with billy clubs, baseball bats and the like. The prisoners are to be made prisoner again and to be disciplined until they acquiesce in the handcuffing of their army comrades, but no more than that, not killed. Thus ran the orders of the Canadian camp commandant. The armament was in keeping with these aims, and then they came inside to reconquer the camp. Thus began what will live on in the annals of prisoners of war as the Battle of Bowmanville. The Canadians' first objective was the cookhouse, which stood nearest to the camp gate and also contained the dining hall. In this stone structure, our enlisted men, whose wooden barracks would have been too flimsy for the approaching operations, had barricaded themselves. They had placed upended tables against the windows and posted themselves behind them, armed with hockey sticks, chair legs and soup ladles. As projectiles, they had readied crockery, cutlery and marmalade jars. And then the Canadians attacked. They broke the windows with battering rams and stuck their heads cautiously into the cookhouse, but the defenders' blows on their steel helmets checked their initial elan. Then one of them made a daring leap into the house. The superior force inside quickly put him out of action and was delighted to have his helmet as booty. But soon, fighting broke out at every window, blows landed on heads and shoulders, marmalade jars and other projectiles flew. Soon there were injuries and on both sides bloody and in part marmalade-smeared faces, which were easy to confuse. The fight swayed back and forth, but in the end the Canadians, with their superior numbers, succeeded in making a decisive breakthrough into the cookhouse and overwhelming its occupants, the conquest of their operational objective. Among the occupants of the cookhouse were the army enlisted men whom the Canadians sought to handcuff, but they had not yet found a single officer. The army officers would still have to be hauled out of the other houses, one house after the other, to be stormed. The next operational objective that presented itself was House 6, which was right beside the cookhouse. As it served as the hospital, however, it was spared from the prosecution of war. Instead, the Canadians attacked House 5, an officers' quarters on the other side of House 6. Its occupants had withdrawn into the cellar and barricaded themselves there. The Canadians thereupon decided upon a different tactic. From outside, they used fire hoses to flood the cellar. And as only a few Canadians were needed for this operation, many of them had the unexpected, welcome opportunity to look through the rooms on the ground floor. And there were so many things to discover. Beer, cigarettes, German medals, rank badges, cockades, valuable objects of every sort. Stimulated by the beer, they took these souvenirs home in their pockets. In the meanwhile, the water had nearly filled the cellar and done its job. The German officers climbed out, dripping wet, with hands up, the way the Canadians had shouted at them to do. Their captors, whom the alcohol had gotten out of control, greeted them with blows, shoves and kicks, readying a regular gauntlet for the Germans to run, with the aim of avenging the injuries their comrades had received during the conquest of the cookhouse. It was not a very sporting conclusion to the capitulation of House 5. The Canadian camp technical officer Captain Brent especially aroused the Germans' anger. In an absurd victor's pose, he let his swagger stick dance indiscriminately on the heads of the German officer as they came up. And thus, the first day of the Battle of Bowmanville came to an end. The Canadians sought out the army officers who were on their list from House 5 and handcuffed them. Yet, this was only a portion of the total to be handcuffed, and the battle itself was still in no way decided. The next day, the Canadian camp commandant for the first time proposed a deal to the German camp leader. If all the army officers on the list would voluntarily support to be handcuffed, some of the officers from House 5 who were being held outside the camp as security could return to their quarters. Yet, Captain Brent's swagger stick had left bad blood. To their nein to the Canadians' proposal, the Germans joined the recommendation that the captain had better not let himself be seen near them again. And insofar as the other army officers were concerned, the Canadians could haul them out for themselves. The situation remained at this stalemate even after the visit of a representative of the Swiss protecting power who rushed to the scene from Ottawa. The latter's attempts at mediation also failed, for by now passions were running high. Under the circumstances, it was only a question of time until war would resume. First, however, the Canadians had to bring in reinforcements from another garrison to make up for the personnel losses they had suffered through injuries. In their absence, the second day of the battle would have passed uneventfully, had it not been for the fact that Captain Brent deemed it necessary to disregard the Germans' warnings and inspect the camp. Of course, he had to view the damage to the buildings. Naturally, his swagger stick was not forgotten, and his movements were closely watched by the Germans. And at a suitable point out of the field of vision of the nearest guard tower, the fist of a German officer laid him low. "This, Captain, is for your swagger stick." Surrounded by a group of Germans, Brent was bound with ropes and paraded through the camp, but this was too much for the guards in the towers, and they fired live rounds. Sand spurted up near the edge of the still intact group. Now, however, there was nothing for it but back into the building, with bullets striking close behind. In the end, one German was tagged. 3 shots had already hit near him in the building's window frames and masonry work. Before he could vanish inside came the 4th, right through the thigh. Admission to the hospital withdrew him from the struggle. The veteran guards now freed Captain Brent from his bonds, and for him the incident was now all over. In succeeding days, he showed no desire for further retribution. Bit of a short one today again, as work is taking up most of my time. I apologize. But it is nonetheless another extremely interesting episode, because we have now reached the Battle of Bowmanville. This is a rather famous mutiny, and the way that everyone is trying to resolve the issue is astonishing. Safe to say, the author is lucky to be in Canadian hands. I'm sure something like this would have ended in bloodshed in other camps and with different captors. We'll see how it turns out in the end. I will see you then. Cheers and bye bye.